So this is just a picture of the tent of meeting or the tabernacle for your reference. So where we left off last lesson in Exodus, remember the question we were wondering is in Exodus 40:35, where Moses was unable to enter the tabernacle to draw closer to God because God's glory had dwelt on the tabernacle. So that led us to ask, if Moses cannot enter, then who can? How can any man or how can Israel dwell with God? So Exodus, the book of Exodus establishes the relationship. The book of Leviticus will explore how exactly is Israel going to draw close to God. And the things that we learn in Leviticus is applicable to us because we know how Christ fulfills many things in Leviticus. So the book of Leviticus is applicable to us by virtue of it showing the work of Christ, what he accomplished. So you can see Leviticus as a book that seeks to solve the problem. How can any man dwell with God? So if you can open your Bibles, let us go straight into Leviticus 1. Now, with many rituals or sacrifices in the book of Leviticus, we do not know the exact purpose or the reasoning why they were being sacrificed. So it takes a bit of research for us to understand. But nevertheless, even though we do not know, we are sure that the Israelites would know. The Israelites would have known the significance. Perhaps that is why it is not recorded for us clearly what the purpose of the sacrifices were, because the Israelites would have known themselves. We go to the burnt offering here, and very important point, is better known as the Ascension Offering. Burnt offering literally in Hebrew means ascension offering, the offering that ascends, the offering that goes up. So the worshipper would choose a male animal, can be a sheep or a bull, and it's without blemish. Now the reason why it's without blemish is because this animal will represent you, the worshipper. You do not want a blemished animal to represent you, correct? And more importantly, this animal was to be without blemish because it is offered to God. So in verse 4, the worshipper will lay hands on the animal. Now we will go into detail a bit later on this act. Then in verse 5, the worshipper and priest will communicate. Maybe they'll sing something. Maybe they'll have a prayer. Maybe the priest will ask the worshipper, why are you offering this sacrifice to God? Then the worshipper will answer. And in verse 5 to 8, we can see the duties of the worshipper and the priest. The worshipper will be the one that does the messy things of cutting the animal up, while the priest will arrange the fire and arrange the animal on the altar. And the important thing about this sacrifice is that the entire animal was burnt, the whole burnt offering. And the climax is not that the animal was burnt. The climax is that there was the ascension of the sweet savor unto God. Right? Again, remember, this is called the Ascension Offering. Right? The focus is on the ascension of the sweet savor towards God. Okay, let's study Leviticus 1 verse 4 in detail, the laying of hands on the animal. Now, how do we relate the atonement of sin to this laying hands ritual? The common understanding is that it is referring to the transfer of sin. When you lay hands on the animal, it symbolizes your sins being transferred unto the animal. But that transfer of sin is seen in Leviticus 16:21, the Day of Atonement, where the high priest lays both hands on the goat. Now that one is clearly a transfer of sin. But perhaps in the burnt offering, this laying of hands does not symbolize the transfer of sin. It rather refers to substitution, right? For example, Moses laid hands on Joshua. It does not symbolize a transfer of sin, correct, obviously. represents substitution. Okay, Joshua was substituting Moses. Joshua is going to represent Moses to Israel. And the burnt offering is not seen as sinful after the laying of hands. If the laying of hands symbolized a transfer of sin, that means the offering would symbolize sin, correct? But the burnt offering does not symbolize sin. The priests are not defiled by carrying the burnt offering away, right? And the burnt offering offers a pleasing aroma, a sweet savor to God. So that goes against the idea that the burnt offering is filled with sin because the sin of the sinner was transferred to this offering. No, the burnt offering is seen as sinless, right? So more likely, the laying of hands would represent the identification of the worshipper with the animal, which will represent him. Okay, the animal was blameless, and he represented the worshipper by the laying of hands. So going into detail, the animal represents the worshipper, and the animal will pay a ransom for the worshipper. Now, what's a ransom? When sin is committed, one can pay a ransom, pay something to save his life. In Numbers 25, we read that Phinehas made atonement. He made a ransom for Israel by killing one of the Israelites. Okay, Israel sinned, so Phinehas made atonement. He paid the ransom. How? By killing one of the Israelites that served as the ransom. Okay, Leviticus 17. The life of the flesh is in the blood. I've given it for you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. So the blood made atonement for the death penalty of sin towards God. Right? We all deserve the death penalty because of our sin. And for the Israelites, they can pay the penalty by the blood of the animal. And this was an act of grace of God, that he allowed the animal's blood to serve as the atonement, the ransom for the death penalty that they deserved. So the summary is this: the animal atoned for a sinner by being the ransom payment that sin occurs. And this is shown by the laying of hands, which is an act of identification that the animal represented the sinner. So the purpose of the burnt offering, there are a few. First, it shows forth obedience, right? There's an obedience in the act. Remember Abraham's act of offering Isaac. The whole thing was an act of obedience. And 1 Samuel 15:22 says that obedience is better than sacrifice. Okay? So your sacrifice must be accompanied with true heartfelt obedience. And second, the burnt offering shows a consecration of oneself wholly to the Lord. Just as the whole burnt offering was burnt, it shows that as we offer this burnt offering, we are offering ourselves to the Lord. And it's also a sign of reconciliation. It's not for particular sins, because that is for the sin offering, which we'll go through in Leviticus 4. But it's more of a general reconciliation between sinful man and God. Sinful man and God are reconciled by this burnt offering. And for some vows, people would also offer the burnt offering to signify the intent of the vows, the faithfulness to keep the vows. And again, I remind the end purpose of this sacrifice. This burnt sacrifice by fire is of a sweet savor that ascends to the Lord. So let's focus on the sweet savor of the burnt offering. So just a summary of what we covered so far. The worshipper takes a blameless animal without blemish to represent him by the laying of hands. The blameless animal dies as a ransom representing him. The blameless animal then ascends in the fire as a sweet savor representing him, the worshipper. And remember, again, the burnt offering is to be rendered as the Ascension Offering. In Judges 13:20, we read that and the angel of the Lord ascended in the fire of the burnt offering. So it can be said that the burnt offering goes into the presence of God, representing the worshipper who comes to God in faith and obedience through the offering. Through this act, the worshipper can be said to go into the presence of God as a sweet savor through the animal that represents the worshipper. So there is this principle that is same in the Old and in the New Testament. Sinners approach God through the death of a sinless substitute who ascends. That is clear in this burnt offering, and that is also clear for us in the New Testament. Through Christ, we approach God. Through the death of Christ, we approach God. In 2 Corinthians 2:15, Paul says that we are unto God a sweet savor of Christ. So Paul identifies with the sweet savor, which is due to Christ, the Lamb, the sinless Lamb, the substitute. The sinner in Leviticus also would identify himself as the sweet savor, which is due to the Lamb without blemish. So the Levitical sinner, through the Lamb, he rises up as a sweet savor to God. Now that reminds us of Psalm 24:3. Right, I covered this in the last lecture. This question of the worshipper, who shall ascend into the hill of the Lord? Who shall ascend? Who shall stand in his holy place? Well, for the sinner in Leviticus, it is true the lamb or whatever animal that stood in his place. And ultimately, all these animals that stood in the place of sinners is a type of Christ, who is the Lamb of God by which we ascend unto God. He is the ascending offering. Okay? Christ is the offering that ascends to God. So, the purpose of the Ascension Offering is that we offer our lives unto God, a sweet savor to God through the Lamb. The Lamb was not destroyed, rather it was transformed into the sweet savor. It was sanctified through the fire. And why I say this is because the focus is on the sacrifice ascension. The focus is not on it being burnt. The focus is on its ascension. So the sinner, the worshipper in Leviticus, through offering this burnt offering, this ascension offering, would be saying that through this sacrificial death, I offer myself to God. I consecrate myself unto God. That is why Abraham and Noah, they offered this burnt offering, this ascension offering to God. And it pleased God because it was not just the sacrifice, but it was the obedience that they had while they offered this sacrifice. And the same for them, and it's also the same for us. And for us, it's because we offer ourselves not through an animal. We offer our obedience through Christ. Christ is the offering by which we offer our lives unto God. So you can see how the gospel is in the book of Leviticus. Christ is the Lamb without blemish, spotless, lived a righteous life, and given as a ransom for many. He ascended to God, not for himself, but for us. John 14:3, Christ says, I go and prepare a place for you, and I'll come again to receive you unto myself. Right? Christ is the one that fulfills Psalm 24:3. Who shall ascend into the hill of the Lord? It is Christ. Christ is truly the one that ascends to God on our behalf. Leviticus 3 has the peace offering, the last offering to be administered after the burnt and sin offering. So it makes us view the whole sacrificial system as a story. You have the sin offering, the forgiveness of sins. Then you have the burnt offering, the offering of ourselves to God. Then we have the peace offering, where the worshipper now has ascended to God's presence and God is the host. The peace offering is where the sinner can eat in the presence of God. We know Psalm 23. God, you prepare a table before me in the sight of my enemies. And Psalm 64, blessed is the man that thou choosest and causest to approach unto thee, that he may dwell in thy courts. We shall be satisfied with the goodness of your house, your holy temple. So here in the peace offering, the worshipper is being in the presence of God, in his house. And what we note about the peace offering is that the best parts were offered to God, the fat, while the rest of the animal was for the worshipper to eat, the fellowship meal at the tabernacle. So the peace offering is a big part of Israel's story. Israel is the special people of God. They were redeemed, and they are the chosen people to approach God. So Deuteronomy 12, God promises them, when you enter into the promised land, you shall enjoy what I give you in the promised land. You shall eat and you shall enjoy. And this is a picture of life before the fall in Eden. This fellowshipping with God. Again, Israel was the special people of God. They were given the privilege to fellowship, to eat before God. And this eating before God is of wonderful benefit to Israel. In Psalm 36, right, the worshipper goes into the house of the Lord. He eats, he drinks, and he is in the presence of the Lord, who is the fountain of life. In thy light we shall see light. So the worshipper is presented as a guest that enjoys the presence of God in his house. Now, the sin offering. Why do we need the sin offering? Because sin defiles the tabernacle. So there's a need of purification. When an Israelite sinned, he defiled the tabernacle. Does not matter whether you sin in the tabernacle or you sin outside the tabernacle. Wherever you are as an Israelite, when you sin, you defiled the tabernacle. The focus of this offering is the cleansing blood. You can see in Leviticus 4, there's a lot of cleansing, sprinkling of the blood. So that's the focus. So the blood of the sacrifice is applied accordingly to the person who sinned. If a high priest or the nation of Israel sinned, the blood was applied onto the altar of incense. If a leader or commoner sinned, the blood was applied onto the burnt offering. Okay? But on the Day of Atonement, where the high priest will go and apply the blood for Israel's sin, the high priest will apply it on the mercy seat, where God's presence was. So there are many occasions for this sin offering. For example, when you commit a sin, or doing things like childbirth or skin disease or bodily discharge, or when you want to make a vow or sins of ignorance, there's many occasions for all of these sin offerings. Now, the purpose is to restore the sin-impaired relationship with God, because the blood is the cleansing agent of the pollution of sin. Only blood can cleanse the tabernacle, which was polluted because of sin. And you can see that there are many animals used in this offering, many different animals. And some of these animals are seen as less important animals compared to the burnt offering, where you have to have a meal without blemish. Here you can have more variety. Perhaps because the reason why is because that the blood is the focus. The blood is the focus. And again, this sin offering points towards the Day of Atonement, which is the day where the sin offering is applied in a special way. We will read of that later. And the reason of the Day of Atonement is because of the pollution of sin accumulated throughout the year, right? The Day of Atonement is near the start of the new year, so new year, you have to start anew. That's why the Day of Atonement is this great cleansing ritual that Israel had to do by the high priest to cleanse the whole tabernacle of the sin that was accumulated through the year as they start the new year. The New Testament application on the sin offering, we can read about all of this here, these verses here. You can pause if you want to. But what is different from the New Testament and Leviticus with regards to the cleansing blood is that in Leviticus, the cleansing blood was applied to the things on the tabernacle. It was not applied directly to the people. But here, Christ's blood is said to be applied directly on us. Now, why? Well, one reason is perhaps is because we are the tabernacle. We are the things that need to be cleansed. We are the ones that go into the presence of God, right? The worshippers in Leviticus, they were kept far away from the tabernacle, right? The closest they could come to was the courtyard outside the tabernacle. So the focus on cleansing was not on them, but rather on the tabernacle itself. But again, for us, it's different because we are the ones that can go into the presence of God, right? So moving along to Leviticus 8 was the ordination of Aaron and sons, the priesthood. Now, Aaron was involved in the golden calf incident we read about in Exodus, but yet he was forgiven. He was forgiven. He was ordained as the high priest despite what he did in the golden calf incident. So one commentator reminded me that this is similar to Peter. Peter denied Jesus 3 times, but yet he was set as the leader of the apostles. Some similarity between Aaron and Peter that shows God's grace in his servants. Okay, so this ordination. Now, before Aaron was ordained, Moses was high priest, right? But now here is the official ordination where Aaron and sons will be the family that will be the priest of God. Now, this was a public event. The whole congregation witnessed the ordination. And you can read the description of what Aaron wore. And you had the jewels symbolizing the tribes of Israel. You had the Urim and Thummim. Now, all of this they had a meaning. There was a meaning behind all of these elements of Aaron's wonderful clothing. And so he was anointed with oil, and he was told to offer the purification and burnt offering. Now, this shows that this high priest, they were sinners as well. They needed to offer purification offerings also. Now, that shows that Christ is indeed the greater high priest. He did not need to do all of this, right? And then we have the blood. The blood was applied on the priest instead of on places. Now, that shows the special position of Aaron, because as the high priest, he was to be cleansed by the blood also, because he was going into the presence of God. And then there was a fellowship meal at the end to end this ceremony in Leviticus 8. Leviticus 9 is an important chapter because it's the climax of what we have been reading so far. So in verse 3, we read of sacrifices prepared before God's appearance, or your burnt offering and all that is being prepared. So they were awaiting God's appearance as a fire, which was what happened in Mount Sinai. Okay, now they wanted the fire on Mount Sinai to appear on the altar. So in verse 8, Aaron now does the sacrifices for the first time for himself and the people, and in verse 22-24 is the benediction. The benediction that we are all familiar with. Aaron pronounced it unto Israel. And verse 23, Moses finally entered the tabernacle with Aaron, and then they came out. So this entering the tabernacle with Aaron, I don't know what they did, but there was probably some form of succession going on where Aaron will now take over the tabernacle worship. And then in verse 24 is the climax. The fire that represents the glory of the Lord came out, right? And it consumed the sacrifices. And so this was a wonderful thing. It shows that God was pleased to accept the sacrifice, to consume the sacrifice by the fire. And this fire was to be kept burning on so that Israel would be reminded of God's fiery presence. That fire on Sinai is now on the altar and to be kept burning to show forth God's ongoing presence among Israel. So if you rewind back to Exodus 24:17, the Israelites were at the foot of the mountain at Sinai and beholding the consuming fire on Mount Sinai from afar, right? But now in Leviticus 9:24, they were closer to it because the altar was in front of them. The fire was on the altar. And so this is the fulfillment of Exodus 29:42-46. The continual burnt offering. I will meet with the children of Israel, the tabernacle sanctified by my glory. I will dwell among them. I am their God that brought them out of Egypt. So that was in Exodus 29 and it's being fulfilled in Leviticus 9:23-24, where the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. The fire came out. So that explains the reaction of the people. They shouted and they fell on their faces. They understood what this meant. This fire was God's presence among them. But it doesn't take too long before we have another crisis. Just like what happened on Mount Sinai with the golden calf incident, here we have another crisis, Nadab and Abihu. So one thing we note is that the tabernacle is seen as a return to Eden, where you have the presence of God dwelling with men, right? But again, sin seeks to disrupt this fellowship between God and man. Leviticus 10 verses 1-3. Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, offered strange fire before the Lord, which he did not command. And there went out fire from the Lord and devoured them, and they died before the Lord. Then Moses said unto Aaron, this is it that the Lord spake, saying, I will be sanctified in them that come near me, and before all the people I will be glorified. And Aaron held his peace. So it's quite sad. God's fire consumed the brothers just as he consumed the sacrifice. Right? God consuming the sacrifices by fire was a wonderful thing. But here, the fire consumed the sons of Aaron. And it's interesting, the response, why God destroyed them. The immediate reply was that because God must be glorified before all people. And how Aaron responded is that he was silent. You contrast this to the joy and shouting previously in Leviticus 9. So this is setting up to be a contrast. Okay? Sin destroys the fellowship between God and man. And this is so evident in the golden calf incident, it's so evident here as well. So what was the sin of Aaron's sons? First, it's clear that there was drunkenness involved in verse 9. And perhaps they did not use the fire on the altar for their duties. It said they offer strange fire. But I think the reason is clear from Leviticus 16. The reason why they died, they were killed by God, is because they entered into the Holy of Holies. So that's why in Leviticus 16, the whole of Leviticus 16 is telling us about how Aaron, the high priest, is going to enter into the Holy of Holies. First, he only can enter on the Day of Atonement, on the day that God has appointed. And second, he cannot come and do his own thing. He has to do what God has ordained. So the death of the sons of Aaron is the preface to Leviticus 16, which tells us of when and what you are to do in the Holy of Holies. Leviticus 16 is telling Aaron, you know how you can not die like your sons? To not die like your sons, you must do all of this. That is what we read in Leviticus 16. This is how we understand the flow from Leviticus 10 to 16. Leviticus 10 talks about the unlawful entry into the Holy of Holies by the sons, where the sanctuary is defiled. And Aaron and Israel have to learn what is holy, unholy, clean, and unclean. We see that in Leviticus 10 verse 10. So Leviticus 11 and 15 talks about this. All the laws on what is holy, unholy, clean, and unclean. So Leviticus 11 to 15 is an intermission between Leviticus 10 and 16. Again, remember, Leviticus 16, in terms of the events, it comes after Leviticus 10. So after the intermission of the laws in Leviticus 11 to 15, we come to Leviticus 16, which seeks to solve the tension that was raised in Leviticus 10. Leviticus 10, you had the death of the sons who entered the Holy of Holies. Leviticus 16 tells us how you are and when you are to enter the Holy of Holies without dying. Okay? The death of Aaron's sons raised two issues. First is, how can Aaron go into the Holy of Holies without dying? Second is, what is holy, what is unholy, what is clean, and what is unclean? So that is what Leviticus 11 to 15 seeks to answer with the many laws. So Leviticus 15:31 says, you shall separate the children of Israel from their uncleanness, so that they do not die, so that they do not defile the tabernacle. Now we have to understand that there were 3 levels of holiness in a way. The priests were deemed holy, so only the holy priest can enter into the tabernacle. The common people, the typical Israelite, were deemed clean. They cannot enter into the tabernacle, but they can dwell around the tabernacle. They were clean, to be clean. And these common people, the Israelites, were to remain clean and not become unclean. How to remain clean? By observing the laws. So there's 3 levels of Israelites' cleanliness. You had the holy people, the priests, and you had the common Israelite who are clean people, and they are not to become unclean. So the role of the priests, they were the holy people, were to facilitate the relationship between the holy God and the clean Israel. So again, this is the context of the clean unclean laws in Leviticus 11 to 15. So just an overview of the clean and the holy and clean laws regarding uncleanness, the food, the childbirth issues, the scenarios, the skin diseases, and all of that. So things such as menstruation, all this uncleanness is not a sin to be forgiven in the sense that it's a moral failure, but nevertheless it requires an atonement for cleansing. Because all of these things is ultimately due to sin. For example, touching a dead body is not a morally wrong act, but it involves sin. Because sin causes death. And we have to remember, God is now dwelling on earth. Earth is filled with sin, but God is dwelling on earth in the tabernacle. So the tabernacle must be kept a clean space. Kept a clean space where there is no ceremonial uncleanliness and there is no sin. Okay, God made Israel holy, and they must remain holy by adhering to all of these laws. Then we also know of the food laws. And this finds its root in Leviticus 20. God says, I am the God that has separated you from other people. So you shall also separate the clean beast from the unclean. Right? God separated Israel, which was clean, from other nations. So Israel is to separate the clean from unclean animals as well. That is the principle. So this separating reminds Israel of their clear separation from the nations. And we know that after, in the book of Acts, after Christ's death and the Spirit coming to people of all nations, meant that this external distinction that only Israel is clean, all this is done away after the resurrection of Christ. So there's actually a threefold division of holiness. You look at the top table first. Who is the holy people? It's actually the priests, in the sense that they are the holy people that can enter into the presence of God in the tabernacle. The clean people are Israel. they are not holy in the sense that they cannot enter the tabernacle, right? They're not holy in the sense that the priests are holy, but they are clean. They are clean, but they are to make sure that they do not become unclean. They do not defile themselves by disobeying the holy and clean laws. Now, who are the unclean ones? It is the Gentiles, right? Remember what we went through in the previous slide. Israel was the redeemed out of the Gentiles, right? Israel was the clean nation that God set apart for himself. Then in the tabernacle as well, we have the holy animals, which were the sacrificial animals. But we also have the clean animals, which Israel can eat, right? They cannot be sacrificed, but they can be eaten. These are the clean animals. Then, of course, we have the unclean animals. Then in the form of the area as well. What is the holy area? It is the tabernacle, right? And what is clean? It is the camp. What is outside the tabernacle? Which was clean. And what is unclean? It is the wilderness outside. So all of this is to say that Israel must remain clean. If not, there will be exile. If Israel does not remain clean, then God, because He's a holy God, He cannot dwell with unclean things. He will leave His presence away. He will not be with Israel anymore. So that was the threat. Now we go to perhaps the highlight of the book of Leviticus, the Day of Atonement. Now if you study this chapter, first, the priest offers offering from himself, and he receives an offering of goats and ram from the people. And the focus here is the entrance into the Holy of Holies. Remember, Aaron's sons died while going to the Holy of Holies. So Leviticus 16 is telling Aaron how he is to enter into the Holy of Holies, how he is to enter at God's timing on the Day of Atonement, and what he is supposed to do. Okay? So Aaron entered into the Holy of Holies. He was to have a cloud made from the censer to protect him from God's glory. If he does not do this, he will die. And the blood from the sin offering to be sprinkled on the mercy seat of the ark. Remember how blood was to cleanse the tabernacle. Now here, this is done likewise as well. But this is special because they are cleansing the mercy seat of the ark. This is only done once a year, because only once a year on the Day of Atonement can the high priest go into the Holy of Holies. And all of this was to make atonement for the Holy of Holies because of the uncleanness of Israel. This was to clean the Holy of Holies, where God's presence was most manifested in. Let us talk about a special pair of goats. So 2 goats were offered for the sin offering in verse 5. Now 1 goat was for the Lord, because this goat's blood would clean the tabernacle. Okay? The other goat was for the sins of Israel. And this was decided by the casting of lots to see which goat did what. So these 2 goats were seen as a set. If you read the language in verse 5, right? 2 goats for the sin offering. It's as if it's 1 goat fulfilling 2 roles, right? So this set of goats fulfilled 2 roles, for purification and for the removal of sins. And you can see how this relates to Christ. Christ did both. He cleansed us, and he also removed our sins by bearing it on the cross. So a summary on the Day of Atonement. What was involved? There was the entrance rite, the priest going to the Holy of Holies. This was a marvelous event. And he went there to clean the place. The blood cleansed the tabernacle. It cleansed the Holy of Holies as well. Then there was an elimination rite where the people's sins were on the scapegoat. The high priest will lay both hands on the scapegoat, confessing the sins of Israel. And then the goat will go into the wilderness. So there is so many purpose for this Day of Atonement. It accomplished many things. It cleansed the tabernacle. It cleansed the priesthood, the sins of the priesthood, and the Israelites also. We went through before that the tabernacle was like a miniature earth, where earth and tabernacle were the dwelling place of God and his people. Now the earth was cleansed by the flood in Noah's time. So that's why the tabernacle needed cleansing also. Where God dwells needs to be cleansed. Where God dwells needs to be cleansed. So if we look forward to the end of the time, there will be a final cleansing and a final renewal of all things which are defiled with sin. And the end of time is not just a cleansing, but it's a renewal of all things. God will dwell on earth again only if it is cleansed. Old Testament, the tabernacle needed to be cleansed. In the New Testament, we are the tabernacle, and that's why we are also cleansed as a dwelling place for the Lord. And that's why as believers we cannot sin. We are not to sin because we are the temple, the dwelling place of God. And in the new heavens and new earth, it will be an eternal dwelling place of God, and there will be no more sin. So that's how we can understand this cleansing of this tabernacle. So the Day of Atonement can be understood as the re-entry into Eden. Remember that Adam and Eve were exiled of Eden. So in Leviticus is the re-entry of God's people back into Eden, into his presence. And what we have went through before, the mountain of God is where God dwells. The tabernacle is a portable mountain of God. It was to represent Mount Sinai. And Eden was a mountain of God. So the Day of Atonement is seen as God's gracious calling of man back into his presence. The high priest could go into the presence of God. And his presence is so real that people can die if they do not do the right thing. Okay, the presence was real. But if this was a re-entry into Eden, then who is the Adam? Well, it's Aaron. Aaron was like Adam, the one that can go into the presence of God. Remember again, Adam and Eve were exiled towards the east of the garden. And now Aaron goes from the east entrance of the tabernacle all the way west back into the presence of God. So it's like a reversal. And again, this shows God's grace. He restores all things. He restores all things. He brings people back into his presence. So, again, who shall ascend into the mountain of the Lord? Who shall stand in his holy place? Who can go into the presence of God? Well, Leviticus tells us the one able to ascend to go into the presence of God is the Adam-like high priest with blood, through the blood on the Day of Atonement. And this reminds us, does it not, of Christ? He is the second Adam. He is the high priest who goes into the presence of God on our behalf through his blood. From Leviticus 17 to 22, it's talking about the laws that regulate the life that's outside the tabernacle. So as you can see what I've written here, 17 talks about the laws outside the tabernacle. Chapter 19 talks a lot about the moral law, the 10 Commandments. And surrounding chapter 19, chapter 18 and 20 talks about the punishment and prohibitions. And ending this part, chapter 21 and 22 talks about the daily life of the priest. The priest was to live a life that was holy, of course, as well. And so the basis for this holy life of the Israelites is that God says, I am the Lord your God. That is the basis. Why is Israel to be holy? Because I am the Lord your God. And also, God is holy. Be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. God is holy, and you're God's people, thus you are to be holy. That shows the close relationship between God and his people. Who God is, must be reflected in the people because they are in this covenantal and close relationship. And not only that, God is the one that makes Israel holy. It's clear in the verse here. I am the Lord that who sanctifies you. So Leviticus moves from, the first part is the sacrifices and all that, so that they can see the glory of God in the fire on the altar. But right now we are moving and transitioning to his inner holy character. So Israel is to really know God, know his holiness and all that. And Israel was to progress in their holiness. Israel was to progress in their holiness, to be more holy each day, due to the fact that the Lord is among them. The Lord is the one who sanctifies them. The obedience also relates to the land which Israel is living on. In this verse, it says that Israel cannot defile themselves because the nation that was previously living in the land that Israel is to live in, they defiled themselves, and that's why they were kicked out. Right? It says that the land itself vomiteth out the inhabitants because they defiled the land. Okay, the Canaanites, they defiled the land, and so they were exiled. The Israelites will move into the promised land here, but they themselves, they are also not to defile themselves, not to defile the land, because if they are defiled, likewise, the land will vomit them out of the land. So Leviticus 26, the second last chapter, it tells us that the goal of holiness, Israel was to progress in their holiness, and the goal of their holiness is that God will draw even closer into them. This verse here says that what God promises as a blessing is that, I set my tabernacle among you. I will not abhor you, and I will walk among you, and will be your God, and ye shall be my people. So that is the motivation for Israel to progress in their holiness. Not only will God dwell among them, but it says here that I will walk among you. So again, this reminds us of the pre-flood walking with God. Adam before the fall walked with God. And Enoch, even after the fall, he had this close relationship with God where it says that he walked with God. So that is the goal of holiness, the goal of the covenant. So that the goal is perhaps a permanent presence outside the sanctuary where God will walk among them. So holiness promises an even more intimate relationship. So that is what is mentioned in Leviticus 26. And if you read Leviticus 26, it also tells us about the reverse side. This is how you will be blessed if you obey, but if you disobey, this is how you'll be punished. So the result of unholiness is desolation and destruction to Israel. The promise of God to walk among his people was never realized by Israel, right? But it is the new covenant that will push God's people into this intimate reality with God. The Mosaic covenant did not accomplish this, but the new covenant will. Because the true Adam, Israel, the true Israel, Christ will bring us to this glorious reality where God will walk among us. That's what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 16. He's saying the same thing. I will dwell in them and walk in them and will be their God, and they shall be among the people. So this God walking among his people is fulfilled in us. It's fulfilled in us already right now. Because God dwells among us. He walks among us. He is in us. This is fulfilled through Christ. Now just some concluding parts about Leviticus. Chapter 24, we read about the lambs and the bread. Okay? And the 7 lamps are set to burn continually before the Lord. You can read more about these lamps in Numbers chapter 8, verses 1 to 4. And in front of the lamps are the 12 loaves of bread, which represents the 12 tribes. And God says that this is a covenantal sign between me and between you. And again, read more about the lamps in Numbers chapter 8. The light of the lamps was to shine in front, towards the bread. Okay, the light was to shine on the bread, which represented Israel. Now that portrays the benediction which we are familiar with. The Lord make his face shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. Right? The light was to shine on the bread, which represented Israel. So all this represented the Lord shining his face on Israel. Leviticus 23 and 25 talks about the Sabbath and the festival. So this is following the Day of Atonement. Okay? The end goal of the dwelling of God in the midst of Israel, the end goal of the washing, making sure that the tabernacle was clean by the blood, all this was so that Israel can have fellowship with God, participate in God's holiness, to enjoy the Sabbath with God every week. And so all of the goal of all of these sacrifices and rituals is so that Israel can have this fellowship and this communion with God. So back to Leviticus 24. So the bread of presence was an everlasting covenant arranged every Sabbath in front of the 7 lambs, which were tended to daily. Okay. So the bread was an everlasting covenant, a sign of the everlasting covenant. So it's related to the Sabbath, which was also a sign of the everlasting covenant. So we have here instituted a calendar where the timing which Israel was to obey was from Sabbath to Sabbath. You had the bread renewed every Sabbath. So they were to view their life with God from Sabbath to Sabbath. You had the weekly Sabbaths, right, to the once in a year Sabbath feast, right, the many feasts, to the land Sabbath every 7th year, to the Jubilee, which came every 50 years. So this was the calendar of Israel, Sabbath to Sabbath. And the renewing of bread every week symbolized Israel being renewed every Sabbath in the light of God. This is one way you can see this. Again, I repeat the point that the goal of all these things is the Sabbath. Exodus ends with Moses unable to go to the tabernacle, but Leviticus ends with Israel enjoying God's presence on the Sabbath. And if you notice, the word Sabbath does not appear until chapter 16 of Leviticus. And from Leviticus 16 onwards, the word Sabbath appears on and on again to the end of Leviticus. It's a main focus for the rest of Leviticus. Exodus 31 says that my Sabbaths you shall keep, the sign between me and you throughout your generations, that ye may know that I am the Lord that sanctifies you. So again, enjoying the Sabbath can be seen as the goal of the Levitical laws. God will dwell among Israel and to sanctify and make them holy in the Sabbaths. So just ending up this lesson, the fulfillment of Leviticus. Now we talked about this before. The tabernacle was a model of earth, which is God's dwelling place. But of course, the tabernacle is not earth itself. The high priest was similar to Adam, going to the presence of God, but is not a real Adamic figure. He cannot truly represent all of us in going into God. And of course, the bloods of bulls and goats cannot truly take away sin. But Christ is the fulfillment of Leviticus. He has an eternal priesthood, and he allows us to enter the holiest places by his blood. And he also perfected us. There's this, Leviticus was good. It was given to Israel to have fellowship with God. But in the sense that, you have this sense that it was imperfect. It was always pointing to a greater reality. And that reality is Christ. And Christ has brought us into this wonderful reality. I'm sure this is clear to all of us, that Leviticus tells us about Christ. In 1 Kings 8, Solomon asked God that he prayed to God, God, when people pray in the temple, please hear us in the heaven. When people pray in the temple, please hear us in heaven. So there was this tension in the Old Testament where God is in two places, where he is truly in the tabernacle, but of course he is in heaven. So it's as if he's in two places at once, if I can put it that way. But through Christ, we go not to an earthly tabernacle, but we go directly to heaven, the heavenly Zion, right now, which will come down at the last day in Revelation 21 we read of. But for that to happen, for Christ to bring us to God, Christ had to become flesh and had to dwell, had to tabernacle among us. And Christ declares himself as the temple, the tabernacle, which will be raised. And Christ declares that he will ascend to the Father after death, ascend as the Lamb. It reminds us of the burnt offering. And you ascend as the priest. And his ascension opens a new and living way for us. And he will descend again on last day and bring us to the new heavens and the new earth. And here's the amazing thing. Right now, God dwells in believers. Okay? God dwells in believers. God makes a home in us. And all this ascend, descend, tabernacle language of Jesus that you read in John, that you read in Leviticus, can be understood. And it all points to union with Christ. All these benefits of Christ's work is given to us. All this dwelling with God is given to us because we are united with Christ by his Spirit. We are made tabernacles, the dwelling places of God. So if you read the book of John and you read the book of Leviticus, you can find that kind of similar language. In John 16:7, Jesus says it's better that I go away. Jesus said it was better that he went away. Why? Now this leads us to a question. Now, Christ was the tabernacle in his incarnation. He was the tabernacle that people were to see. The holy tabernacle dwelling among men, dwelling among sin. Now, if Christ is the tabernacle and he goes away, does that mean that the tabernacle would also go away? So you can understand that the disciples were discouraged when Jesus said that he would go away. But it's better that Jesus goes away. Because when Jesus goes away, the Spirit which was with them, in Jesus was with them, will be in them when Jesus pours out his Spirit. Jesus will continue to be with them, and the Spirit, which is a far greater reality than just being with the Spirit. Now the Spirit is in us, not just with us, but in us. And God, through this, dwells in us. And we are made tabernacles as well. Now, the sacrifices were not just about removing sin, but were also about obedience. So, Jesus' death is seen as fulfilling the roles of the two goats in the Day of Atonement. It's not just an offering to himself, just like that. It's an offering of his obedient life to God, that is well-pleasing to God. We read that the Ascension Offering was a sweet savor unto God. Now the sacrifice of Christ, his righteous life given in his death, was also well-pleasing to the Lord. And the veil was torn in Mark 38. The veil of the temple was torn. Now we know that Jesus' death removed the old temple system and brought in the new temple of his body. It removed the veil that hid the presence of God. Now the presence of God is unhidden to us. And remember, the aim of the tabernacle was to have where God's presence was. And also the aim of the tabernacle was the rituals in which one can go to God. Now Jesus' death fulfills both. Through Jesus' death, we can experience God's presence. And through Jesus' death, he has fulfilled the Levitical rituals, so to speak. Through the blood of Jesus. At the end of times, this is the reality. There'll be no more physical temple, no more physical boundaries between us and God. Because it's said here that the Lord is the temple himself. The Lord himself will dwell among us. He will walk among us and we can go into his presence. But nevertheless, right now, we enjoy this reality that God is in us because his Spirit dwells in us. So if we have time in the future lessons, let us explore this topic about how God makes his dwelling in us by his Spirit. So this lesson series will take a break for a few weeks. And when we come back In the next two lessons, we'll cover the rest of the Old Testament to the prophets, and we'll cover the book of Joshua and Judges, and we can understand more of Israel's disobedience in light of what we learn. In the past three lessons, we have learned God's grace in giving Israel so many things. So by understanding that, we can understand Israel's disobedience more. How unjustifiable Israel's disobedience to God is. How sad it is to break their covenant with God, their disobedience and all that. And we also will understand the Davidic covenant. We covered the Mosaic, Levitical system, right? We also understand the next milestone, which is the Davidic covenant, where God makes his covenant with David as well. So until then, we'll pray that this lesson benefits you, the past three lessons, and I'll see you again very soon. Thank you.